On this computer. All right, so hello, friends and comrades, welcome to another Educate Against Genocide class, one of the classes we've been hosting for the Midwestern Marx Institute's Marxism School. Today, we have the honor to have a friend of the Institute, Dan Kovalik, on. Dan is a senior research fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. He teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and is the author of many amazing books, including The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, Nicaragua, A History of U.S. Intervention and Resistance, and Cancel This Book, The Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture, and many, many more. Today, Dan is going to tell us about a few things, including his recent trip to the West Bank and the current situation that is unfolding in Gaza, where we're seeing an exterminationist campaign against an indigenous people waged by the U.S.'s imperialist proxy in the Middle East, the state of Israel. Today's class is going to be quite interesting in terms of structure. We have a class-based interview, so we have pulled questions from the students that we will be asking for the next hour or so to Dan. But before we get into those questions, Dan, can you tell us a little bit about your recent trip to the West Bank and some of the things that you saw?
Yes, so I went to the West Bank for a week. I got there by flying into Amman, Jordan, and then traveling by land across the King Hussein Bridge into the West Bank, which is honestly pretty much the only way you can get there now. The airport in Tel Aviv, while Israel is too embarrassed to say so, is barely functioning at all. There's only a couple airlines flying out of the Tel Aviv airport because of Hamas shelling. So really the only practical way to go is in through Amman. And I stayed in Ramallah, which is the de facto capital of Palestine. That's where the government, the Palestinian Authority, operates out of. And Ramallah is an interesting place. It's a major city and feels pretty normal for the most part. It's in Area A in the West Bank. And if people don't know, there's three different areas under the Oslo Agreement, which was agreed to in 1992. And elements of that agreement are now part of both international law and Israeli law. So, Area A in the West Bank means it's under full control of the Palestinian Authority, and Israelis are not allowed into Area A. Area B, Israelis are allowed in if necessary, but with notice. And Area C, essentially, the Israelis can go in anytime. Even though Ramallah is in Area A, Israeli troops violate that all the time and go in regularly. They were there when I was there. They shut down a business because it's owned by a Palestinian political prisoner. It's a printing company. They stole the printing press. The building I was staying at is owned by a friend of mine named Amal and her husband Mohammed, both of whom are Palestinians. They were arrested, jailed, and also deported during the first Intifada. And their building was invaded a few weeks ago by Israeli soldiers who arrested a young man out of the building, ended up killing two Palestinians in the process. So this is a very common occurrence. Since October 7th, almost 300 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank. That's more than have been killed in all of last year. So that's a huge number. And around 3,000 Palestinians have been arrested in the West Bank. Again, a huge number of people. Most of these are young men. Some are women, some are children. And so the repression in the West Bank has greatly increased since October 7th, particularly, by the way, in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is a special case for a number of reasons. First of all, East Jerusalem was supposed to be the capital of the Palestinian state under the Oslo Agreement. But Israel's basically now claimed all of Jerusalem. And remember, Donald Trump, as president, recognized all of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was a very provocative move. Interestingly, there were a few other countries who did. The one that I know that also did that was Guatemala, under a right-wing president who'd been a death squad leader. And that was thanks to Israel, because they were very instrumental in supporting the military dictatorship in Guatemala, particularly in the late 70s when Jimmy Carter and Congress cut off aid because they were upset with the violence by the Guatemalan government. So, of course, Israel came in and continued funding them, and they funded Guatemala through the worst years of the General Rios Montt dictatorship. Those are just important things to know about Israel and its behavior. I went, but in any case, in Jerusalem, the demolition of homes, of Palestinian homes, is increasing. The settlements are expanding. Israel's really making a play to take over all of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, as you probably know, is pockmarked by these huge walls that divide the whole city. Of course, these walls are everywhere, but in Jerusalem, they're very, very prominent. The walls in the West Bank are longer and taller than the Berlin Wall, which, of course, everyone greatly maligned. And they use the wall in Jerusalem to expand the number of Israelis in Jerusalem. So, for example, they'll include Israelis within the wall, even though they're outside the city limits, within the city limits, to increase their number vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And they've done the opposite with the Palestinians, walling off Palestinians who have been in Jerusalem for years and years and were technically within the bounds of Jerusalem, but cutting them out of Jerusalem so that the number count favors the Israelis, because and they do that throughout all of Israel, Palestine. I mean, they play this demographic game to try to gain a majority everywhere they are. I made it to Bethlehem, which was no small feat. Bethlehem is 15 miles from Ramallah, where I was staying. So, and it's all expressway. So, if things were normal, in a normal world, it would take you half an hour at most to get from Ramallah to Bethlehem. In fact, it took 3 hours one way and 4 hours back. And that's because there are Israeli checkpoints all the way through. And only certain people can travel to certain places. And I didn't even know this till I went there. So what you need is someone with an Israeli yellow plate, and you can travel anywhere. And those are only for Israelis or for Palestinians born in Jerusalem. They have a special status. And so the person who drove me has a yellow plate. He's an interesting guy. He has an Israeli citizenship and British citizenship. He was born in Palestine in 1946, before Israel was founded. And so we went as international tourists to Bethlehem, because as an Israeli, he's not allowed in, because Bethlehem is also Area B, you see. And it's surrounded by a wall, which the Israelis built. It's completely surrounded by a wall. And the Israelis can shut these cities off at any time. They can lock them down. They have gates and walls around all these cities. Even Ramallah, as big as it is, on a moment's notice, they can lock it down. And they did that for a few weeks after October 7th. Now, in a city like Ramallah, that's not terrible, because it's a big city. You have all the amenities you need. But if you're in a small village that's locked down and you don't have a hospital, for example, you can't leave to go to the hospital. So women have given birth at these gates, have lost babies at these gates because they can't get through to give birth at a hospital. So it's a very draconian system. Even so, between Ramallah and Jerusalem, it's 8 miles. That should take you 15 minutes. On the day I went, it took me an hour and a half because the closest gate was closed. And it was closed because the Israeli forces had invaded the Palestinian refugee camp next to the gate. They shot 5 people, wounding 5, killed 1 person. And they also destroyed a bunch of goods from merchants there, mostly food that they threw out. And it's very interesting to know that even within the West Bank, there's all these refugee camps where Palestinians live. Because the Palestinians, after the Nakba in 1948, were refugees, and many of them are still refugees. In Gaza, 70% of the people there are they're refugees from the Nakba. 70%, So it's a people of
You
refugees.
do. He old as fuck, bro.
What's that?
I think someone's muted, so please keep going, Dan. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So, and I went to Bethlehem, which was interesting. Of course, it's Christmas time. Bethlehem is the birthplace of Jesus. I went to the Church of the Nativity where they claim Jesus was born. There's a place marked there for where he was born and where he was laid to sleep. It's very moving to go there. But there are no celebrations in Bethlehem. The Christian patriarchs all signed a letter they sent to Joe Biden saying that Christmas was canceled, as my mother used to threaten to do every year. But they did cancel Christmas, saying they weren't going to celebrate because of what's happening in Gaza. So there were no Christmas trees, there were no lights. And there's no tourists. I mean, there's no tourists in the West Bank. I mean, I was one of the few tourists there because people are afraid to go there right now. The one thing I'll just say, and then I'll open it up to the other questions. I don't want to take too much time, but that's really remarkable about the Palestinians is their hospitality. Anyone will tell you that. And, everyone I visited had food for me, had coffee, even the poorest people. I'd meet families of young men that were killed even like a week before, or someone whose son was just jailed, or son who just returned from jail. And they always had something, a little coffee, a little candy for you. And it's quite moving. It's a very welcoming place, and so much the opposite of what, of course, the media portrays about Palestine and the Palestinian people. So it was a very enriching trip for me, infuriating. I mean, to see how Palestinians are treated as second-class citizens, where they don't have freedom of movement if they're not born in Jerusalem. And even if they're born in Jerusalem, they can't get into the old city unless they live in the old city. And the old city's where everything's at. Al-Aqsa Mosque is in the old city. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is said to have been the place where Jesus was buried and then rose from the dead. So some of the most significant historic and religious sites are in the old city. And most Palestinians have no right to go in there, and that's life in the West Bank. So as I told one of my Palestinian friends, I said, if I lived here, I'd be angry every day. And he said, well, it's pretty frustrating. But you don't see the anger. You don't see people yelling at each other or honking their horns. And I had just been to Egypt 2 weeks before. Everyone was honking their horns and yelling at each other. And you don't see that in the West Bank. So, okay. So now I'm glad I answered. And sorry, I have a little cold. I've been traveling a lot and I'm fighting a little cold here. So
Thank you so much for that portrait, Dan. It's a difficult one to hear about, but beautiful at the same time to see the tremendous humanity of the Palestinian people and how they face these tragic conditions that they're in and keep their chin up, as we say here in the States.
it's
Um,
amazing. It's amazing. Yeah.
We'll open it up to questions. I believe the order, Sam was one of the first ones with the questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dan, for being here, of your service to our cause and our movement. The first question, you covered a fair amount of it with your very moving experiences. But so Gaza understandably receives much more media coverage than the West Bank. What should people who have solely been paying attention to the developments in Gaza know about the West Bank, specifically its history since 1948, and then what has been happening there since October 7th, such as the increased settler violence? So, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, the West Bank is an interesting place. So all of Palestine for some time in the first part of the 20th century was a British protectorate. And then in 1948, as you know, the state of Israel was founded. The Nakba was carried out, which was a process of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, in which at least 700,000 Palestinians were violently ethnically cleansed and made refugees by the invading Israeli forces. The West Bank would eventually become a protectorate of Jordan, of the Kingdom of Jordan, for some time until 1967, till the 1967 war, 6 Days War. And Gaza during that same period up till 67 was the protectorate of Gaza. So a number of Palestinians in the West Bank actually have Jordanian passports, and that's how they travel, which is an interesting thing. And there's still remnants of Jordan there. There, you know, there's a beautiful hotel there that King Hussein stayed at, and that's been taken over by Israel. He had a beautiful state of the art giant hospital built for the Palestinians in Jerusalem, and had it fully furnished with medical equipment. That is now a police station, a giant police station of the Israelis in Jerusalem. So that's an interesting thing. So after 1967, the Israelis began to occupy the West Bank. And then the PLO emerged under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, began resisting the occupation. And eventually in 1992, the Oslo agreements were agreed to between Arafat and President Rabin of Israel, who would later be assassinated by a radical Israeli who didn't like the Oslo agreements. And the Oslo agreements contemplated a two-state solution in which Palestine would have its own state in the West Bank and Gaza. At that time, there were no walls, and there were no gates and all that. And you could drive freely from West Bank to Gaza and back. It only took a half an hour, I was told. Since the Oslo agreements, Israel and the murder of Rabin, Israel's done everything it could to destroy the possibility of a two-state solution. They cut Gaza off from the West Bank. There's no way to get between those two places. And many families were separated because of that. They built the walls throughout the West Bank and the settlements, all these Israeli settlements. And so when you see that map, that famous map everyone has seen with, you know, this is Palestine 1948, this is Palestine now, it's Palestine 1967, this is Palestine today. You see all those pot marks in the West Bank, and those are all settlements, Israeli settlements, designed to, again, give Israelis a demographic superiority there, and to push the Palestinians out, essentially. The goal is to move the settlements further and further out so that eventually they take over all the land. And all the settlements, for the most part, are up in the top of the hills and mountains. And it creates an interesting and terrible dynamic. One of them is the settlements often drain their sewage and their waste onto the Palestinian villages and housing below intentionally. Obviously, they could find another way to deal with their waste, but it's a way to abuse the Palestinians. They also have their own expressways and metro system that connects the settlements, so they don't have to deal with all these gates and walls and nonsense. They showed me an expressway they took me over that goes over a Palestinian neighborhood, so they don't even have to. And the guy who took me had the yellow tag, so he was allowed to go on it. If you're a Palestinian, you can't. And underneath is a Palestinian neighborhood, so the Israelis don't even have to deal with the Palestinians below, don't have to drive through their neighborhood, whatever. So, I mean, the idea that this is not an apartheid state is a joke. I mean, it is so obvious. I mean, South Africa never had these walls. I mean, these are apartheid walls. And of course, as the South Africans say about Israeli-Palestinian apartheid, they say it's worse than in South Africa because in South Africa, the whites needed the black population to work, needed to work in the mines and raise their kids and all that. The goal was not to get rid of black people. It was to keep them in their place, in their own separate places, but not to totally expel them. That is not true with Israel. They want to just expel the Palestinians. And so the West Bank is important to keep an eye on, especially because of Jerusalem, which is the prize for everyone. I mean, it is the holy city. It has all these ancient churches, mosques, synagogues, the Wailing Wall. I mean, basically, this is the place of worship for all three major religions. Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is in the old city, is the third most important Muslim holy site in the world. And the Israelis have troops around it, and often settlers and or soldiers will go into the mosque and cause trouble in order to, again, provoke the Palestinians. Ultimately, Israel wants to take over that mosque and convert it into a synagogue. And you probably know that evangelical Christians support this. They believe once Israel takes full dominion over Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that the end days will come and the good will be taken body and soul to heaven, and the rest of us sinners will burn. And they relish this, right? They want this to happen. It's insane. But so Jerusalem's this very, very important place, and it's a very depressing place because this is the pressure on Palestinians is worse there than anywhere. So, yeah, I think Gaza obviously right now needs the attention it's getting, but the West Bank should be definitely paid attention to. And so Biden never countermanded Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, to move the embassy there. So that is still the status quo. And that's something we should advocate against. Under international law, East Jerusalem is still part of Palestine. I mean, the international law has not changed, but the U.S. position has changed, which is very important, as you know. So,
Yeah, that's something we hope to get at today if we have time. The international law dimension of it and how it's broken without any repercussions by the Israeli state. But our next question, I believe, is from Ayo. Ayo, please.
Mhm. Yep. Palestine is a shining beacon in its resistance to empire. Can you talk about Palestinians' refusal to submit even while facing genocide? I'm also interested in the anti-imperial tendencies of Ansar Allah and Hezbollah. How did they become radicalized? And many groups face oppression, but not all become anti-imperialist.
right. Yeah, the Palestinians are incredible people. I mean, you're seeing that in Gaza where You'll see a video. I saw a video of this girl. She must have been 10 years old, and she had been removed from the rubble. And they said, "Are you going to leave?" And she goes, "I'll never leave. And if they kill me, I'll become a seed for the resistance." I mean, this is a 10-year-old girl. I mean, that's how they are. I mean, it's incredible. It's funny. Even my host made a joke. We were driving, and these two young men walked very slowly in front of our car, and she said, "See, they're going nowhere. These Palestinians are going nowhere. You can't make a move." And she showed me this house that was in the middle of a Israeli settlement, one Palestinian home they wanted to get rid of, and they offered the guy $5 million for his home, and he won't sell it. So they're very stubborn when it comes to that, and very revolutionary, and that's why they inspire people, and that's why people like Mandela and Fidel Castro and Muhammad Ali and others say, that how important Palestinian liberation is to the liberation of the world. And so I think they're going to win this, to be honest. I mean, I do think Israel's losing this battle. It may not appear that, because Israel's so excellent at murdering children and destroying hospitals, but they're not very good at hand-to-hand combat with these resistance fighters. They're losing that, and they know that. So now, sadly, in the meantime, look, Gaza could be destroyed. I mean, and that's why we have to call for a ceasefire, because yes, I think the Palestinians will win, but the casualties are incredible. In terms of Hezbollah, I'm not an expert on Hezbollah, but they got the genesis of them, I believe, came from Israel's invasion with the United States' help of Lebanon in 1982, which was a very brutal invasion, which was meant to get rid of not Hamas, the PLO at that time, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had moved its base to Beirut under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. But as we see in Gaza, very shortly after the Israelis invaded again, and the U.S. sent Marines too, the PLO left Lebanon. But that didn't stop the massacres. They continue massacring people, including in a refugee camp I've been to, the Sabra Shatila refugee camp outside Beirut, in which thousands of Palestinians were killed and raped by these right-wing Christian phalangists that Israel supported to go in there. This is what radicalized Hezbollah, and they built from there and became an incredible resistance force, mostly in the south of Lebanon. Lebanon is a very pluralistic state. There's Christians, Muslims, Jews, other, and it doesn't even have a functioning government right now. It basically has this, like, different parts of the country are ruled by different people, and the south is governed by Hezbollah. And in 2006, Hezbollah defeated Israel very handily, and so to be trifled with. Hezbollah also played an incredible role in Syria, which I learned when I went to Syria in 2021. They really defended that country from the jihadists that the West was supporting, the Free Syrian Army, the moderate rebels that were not moderate, including, I'll just say, I was very surprised, Hezbollah defended Christian sites in Syria and Lebanon too. But in Syria, for example, the city of Malula, which is one of the last cities in the world that speaks Aramaic, the language of Jesus Christ, the Free Syrian Army, backed by the U.S. and Israel and other countries, went in to try to destroy that Christian city. And it was Hezbollah, along with the Syrian army, that drove them out. And any priest or nun will tell you that. It's very interesting. Hezbollah is amazing, very ethical fighting force. So, and anyway, that's a little history for you there.
Oh man, that's beautiful to hear. Thank you so much for that. The next question is from Tony. Tony, would you like to ask your question?
Okay. My question is, how long do you think the halted trade in the Red Sea by Yemen will last? And will Yemen's actions bolster the other Arab countries' resolve to sanction Israel?
Well, I think it's going to last until this war ends. I mean, that's what the Yemen has said, and I take them at their word. They're being very effective. They've shut down about 85% of shipping in the Red Sea. Insurance costs for insuring a ship to go through the Red Sea has tripled. So they don't have to do a lot. See, that's the thing. All they have to do is threaten these ships, and they're not going. Those shipping companies are not going to take the chance. So I think they can keep it going as long as this war keeps going. And yes, I do think it will inspire other actions. I hope it shames other Arab countries into doing something, even if it's just refusing to sell oil to Israel, which is insane that they continue to sell oil. In fact, when I entered Israeli customs, there was a huge line of oil tankers lined up to get through, and they all had Arabic writing on them. They all were coming from Arab countries, and that's a shame. In 1973, when there was a conflict, OPEC initiated an oil embargo. It crippled Israel, and it drove oil prices through the roof, and it impacted that conflict immediately. And they could do that now. And I do hope something like that will be done. And I think Yemen's example will certainly help push towards that.
Thank you. The next question is from Julie.
Hello. My question is, can we expect the high unemployment rate in Palestine to be more or less permanent because of apartheid even after a ceasefire? And what effect are the workers being brought in from abroad having on Palestinians? Are workers from abroad even coming anymore?
That's a good question. Yeah, you probably saw that some of the hostages taken were Taiwanese workers. And Netanyahu said he wanted to bring in 100,000 Indian workers to replace all the Palestinian laborers that were coming from Gaza and aren't anymore. And I think President Modi told him to go fuck himself. But in any case, I think sadly in Gaza, I don't see how there will be anything but 100% unemployment for a while. I mean, it's been leveled to the ground. There's nothing. Every university's been leveled. The hospitals have been leveled. I mean, there's no economy there. So the unemployment rate there is going to be severe. And I think in the West Bank too, and even amongst Israelis, because this conflict has crippled the economy on both sides. And I don't see it returning anytime soon. And that's what's hurting Israel. I mean, the Palestinians can weather that sort of thing, but the Israelis are pretty pampered. They really can't. And 500,000 Israelis have already left the country. So I think there will be very high unemployment and real serious economic problems. In terms of laborers, foreign laborers, I'm not certain how many are left. Will they keep coming? Hey, when there's work, they'll find laborers. I'm certain that'll happen, but it probably won't be easy at first because people will be reluctant to come. So I think it's going to be a very difficult time for Palestinians and Israelis alike in terms of the economy and unemployment for some time to come.
Thank you for that. That's a really good question because Palestinian labor is central to the construction industry in Israel, and more than 100,000 of them were kicked out after October 7th, and partially those Modi saying no to sending in Indian workers was thanks to 10 of the leading trade unions in India showing tremendously courageous solidarity with the Palestinians and in rejecting that move very strongly, which is an interesting perspective because most of what we see from Indian commentary on Israel-Palestine issues online is like the nationalist side of things that's very pro-Israel, but that's not the whole political spectrum over there in India. But
No,
thank you,
no.
Julie, for that question. I think Daniel, you're up next.
Yeah, speaking of unions, can you talk about the importance of union organizing in the context of the current genocide, as well as anti-imperialist struggles more generally? We are starting to see prominent unions like the UAW calling for a ceasefire. In what ways do you think we as workers can help put an end to the genocide in Palestine and while also weakening corporate interests at home?
Yes, well, I was a labor lawyer for 26 years. I worked for in-house for the United Steelworkers Union. And unions still have a lot of power in this country. And what better organized the workers are, the stronger labor is in the bigger voice it has. So it's critical to this. And the fact that you have major unions now, again, calling for a ceasefire. The postal carriers, I think, was the first one. I think they have a very anti-Zionist Jewish president who's been very outspoken about this. And I believe the UAW maybe has also called for a ceasefire. And if other unions would do that, that would be huge because, of course, they have a lot of influence in the Democratic Party. They're still a key part of the Democratic coalition. So if they put pressure on Biden, that would be huge. And so I think we need to agitate amongst the unions to do that. And then, you have the longshoremen on the West Coast who, they're I think their first president, Harry Bridges, I don't know if he was his first president, but he was a communist. It's been a very left-wing union. And I believe they have stopped some shipments to Israel, and that can be critical. So there's no doubt that labor can really have an important say in this. And we need other unions to speak out. And as you know, labor has had a mixed history, certainly during the Cold War, in terms of its foreign policy positions. Some have been terrible. In fact, you probably know about the AFL-CIA and all that, how labor helped with the coup against Allende and different things. I think those days are largely over, though they still get a lot of, aid from for their international work from the National Endowment for Democracy and that sort of thing. But I think they're have a better position than they've had in a long time. And I do think they could be very important, especially in an election year, because Trump has a lot of working class support, and Biden knows that. So if labor takes a firm position on Palestine, it'll make a difference for sure.
Absolutely. That's been one of the developments of the ceasefire movement that we've been trying to track the closest, because I think those are the pressure points of capital. If the working class says no, we want a ceasefire, everything falls. So I think we had one question afterwards, after Danny from Zena, but she's not here, so we'll skip to
She
my
asked me
question.
to read
Oh,
it. She's currently on a plane. She's listening in on the
okay.
Zoom. Her question is, what are your thoughts on what we need to do here in the United States to reduce the grip of AIPAC on legislation and legislators and reduce the ADL's impact on public opinion?
Well, I think we need to do what we've been doing. I mean, I think, what is happening and what needs to continue happening is for the myth of Israel to be burst. The idea that it's the most moral army and that that basically God chose Israel is the chosen people and all that, giving it some moral veil of moral superiority. We need to challenge that every single day. And that's being done through social media, especially showing the brutality of Israel in Gaza. And we need to pressure our representatives and educate them about this brutality, and that Israel is not the most moral army, and that what is being done to the Palestinians is illegal, immoral, and it cannot be tolerated. You know, we're never going to outmatch those groups in terms of money. But I think we are beating them in the propaganda game for the first time in 75 years. So continuing to be active on social media on this, and also writing letters to the editor of your newspapers, demonstrating, those are the things, you know, those are what things we need to do. We need to keep doing it. We are winning. And again, we've never been winning on this issue. And we are. So I would just say full speed ahead.
We can also approach the Fettermans and their ilk in bars and have those
Yes, we
videos
can
go
do that
viral.
too. Yeah, and I agree. Those people should not have a night's rest. Should not be comfortable at all until this thing is over. They should be met and bothered whenever possible.
Absolutely. So the last question here, as we're getting close to the finish time. In 79, Fidel stood in front of the United Nations and asked what the purpose of the UN is. What goal does it serve if it allows such misery to coexist alongside such prosperity in the hands of a few? And I think seeing the genocide of the Palestinian people unfold over the last 60 plus days forces us to re-ask this question. What good is the UN if, in the face of the sort of genocide that it was created to prevent, it sits idly by, failing to materially challenge the exterminationist aims of the US and its Middle East proxy, Israel? So why does Israel and the US get to violate international law and commit crimes against humanity free of punishment in global institutions like the UN?
Yeah, well, sadly, because the U.S., being one of the most powerful countries in the world economically and militarily, has been able to take the instruments of international law captive, like the International Criminal Court. Even though the U.S. is not a party to the Rome Statute of the ICC, right? It calls the shots there. And that's why the ICC is saying nothing about this genocide. The international institutions in the UN itself have, by design, by design of the US, which has undermined the United Nations and its functioning for decades, is not functioning to maintain international peace and security, which is their mandate. And I don't want to say it should be scrapped. I think there's still elements of it that can be used, but it needs to be reformed. And it needs to take away the veto power, or at least water down the veto power of countries like the United States. The U.S. cannot be able to be one sole country who could veto a resolution to protect civilians in Gaza and to call for a ceasefire. So some people have advocated increasing the number of the countries on the Security Council, increasing the number of countries that have veto power, and maybe requiring more than one veto for a veto to be effective. 2 vetoes or 3. And if you even just had 2, this last resolution would have passed because the US was the only veto. Even Great Britain abstained. So I think that we need to reform the UN so that it does represent also the will of the great majority of the world's people. To not have India, for example, on the Security Council is ridiculous. You know, it has over 1 billion people. The only reason those countries are on the Security Council, the ones that are there, are because they won World War II. And in the case of France, that's not even true. Most of World War II, they were fighting with the Nazis. So it's a historic relic. And there are moves. Russia, China, other countries are thinking about ways to reform it. And I think that will happen. I do. But in the meantime, yes, it is not playing a good role. I was just on a panel with some other lawyers today talking about that very problem, and it's something we need to confront because we need international law. We need international institutions to protect people like the Palestinians right now. And that's not happening is a real shame.
I couldn't agree more. Dan, thank you so much for your time. Do you have one more do you have time for one more outing question that we can phrase it as a half plug, half question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
Um, yeah, as we've been discussing today, there have been various levels at which Israel is losing. I think the information wars is clearly one of them. It has very little consent at the global scale, especially in the global south and the global majority. Um, but it's also been losing the actual fighting. It seems like, as you mentioned, the only thing it's skilled at is bombing babies. And it's even faked earlier this week pictures of Palestinian soldiers surrendering, and it was very clearly faked pictures. So, how do you see this unfolding with Israel losing in these two very important fronts, but winning in a front that actually makes it lose in the other front, the information war front? How do you see this unfolding?
Well, as any military leader will tell you, wars are not about winning battles. You can win every battle and lose the war. And the Vietnamese proved that, the Chinese proved that. This is a war of attrition in more than one way. And in wars of attrition, the indigenous people do tend to win because they have something really to lose and they have something to fight for. And that's what you're seeing right now. I think when the smoke clears on this, Israel's going to have a big problem, and that is that they have lost. Again, the myth of who they were is gone. And what is that going to mean? It means it won't have the international support it used to have. Even in the US, they're going to struggle more and more to get support. They have a demographic problem in Israel Palestine. They always have had one. The Palestinians reproduce at a much greater rate than the Israelis. So they constantly need an influx of immigrants to keep Israel afloat. And they won't come. The young people, the young Jews in the world, in the West, in the United States, are going to stop coming because they don't believe in the project anymore. They've lost a whole generation of people. So I think Israel's going to have an existential crisis that they've made, not because of Hamas, because of their own doing, because of their own cruelty, and they've exposed themselves. Netanyahu has sacrificed Israel for this. I don't think in the long run Israel will stay what it is, a one ethnic religious state. I think it will be transformed because of what's happening in these weeks and months. But the key is while that plays out is to try to protect as many Palestinian lives as possible.
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful way to end it. It's been a tremendously insightful conversation. Dan, anything you'd like to plug? Any books you'd like to point our audience towards?
I am working on right now a book called The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. You can pre-order it. It's on Amazon for pre-order. You can go to my publisher, skyhorsepublishing.com, and check it out. I'm on Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik. You can follow me there. It's where I do most of my kind of political ranting. Otherwise, I just encourage you to keep fighting. The fight, the water's fine. It's good. It's a good life. I'm 55 years old. I've been an activist since I was 19. I've never regretted a day of it. And I'm more active now than I've ever been in my life. And it keeps me going. It'll keep you young. I'm actually 95 years old. No, but anyway, so I just urge you to keep going and do it with a smile. like the Palestinians do. You know, be a happy warrior, and you'll live till you're 100 years old, whether you want to or not. So there you go.
Beautiful. Thank you. Very wise words to live by. All right, Dan. We're gonna keep the class going for another hour or so. You're free to depart. We have taken quite a bit of your time, and thank you again for your brilliant insight.
Thank you. Happy holidays and happy new year to everyone. I appreciate
Like-
you. Okay, bye-bye.
All righty, folks. So this is the first time running Danny's class, so I think that went pretty well. It was a beautiful interview with Professor Dan Kovalik. I'm not sure what you all would like to do for the next hour, so I think it'd be good to sit down and discuss some of the things that Dan brought up, and also talk other contemporary events concerning this ongoing genocide. Apologies for not being Danny. He's much more prepared to guide this class than I am. I'm just a simple philosopher. But yeah, I'll open it up to the class if there's any comments or questions, or um, anything that came up that has you
I had
thinking. Yeah, go ahead, Judy.
I had a follow-up to the last question about the unions.
Mhm.
I have a friend who is on staff at a major union, and a couple months ago he was telling me that one of his coworkers actually got fired for putting "from the river to the sea" as his the sign off on his emails. He was actually fired for that. And so my friend was saying that there's this chill that has gone through like all of like the union staff, where it's like, don't be seen at a Palestine rally, don't like let anybody know what your politics are, or like they're looking to fire people.
Wow. I haven't read anything about that, but it doesn't surprise me. From what I've seen with something like UAW is that the membership is so militantly like pro-Palestine that the Zionists have came out to talk about it as an anti-Semitic Muslim captured union or something, in the usual derogatory and baseless forms in which Zionists respond to these sorts of things. But um, did you mention, or is that something you'd like to keep confidential, what union it was,
It
or
was asked me.
it was what?
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, that would have been, I wish we could have asked Dan that question because of his background in labor law. Um, yeah, the repression is going to be well, it has been pretty intense and pretty broad, because I think this is the first time in US history where, in order to repress the dissenters, you have to repress, in some sectors, um, most of the people. Like, you've seen the news that has came out concerning like the potential attacks on college students that show sympathies with the Palestinian plight. Well, if you attack people in college that show sympathy with the Palestinian plight, and demographically, those 18 to 35-year-olds are supporting the Palestinian cause around 70-ish%, especially the ones in college, you have to repress almost everyone. That's something that is historically unique. Neither of the two previous intensified Red Scares had a similar component, because the Reds were always the minority, right? Now with these cases, that's not necessarily the case anymore.
I would think that the American Civil War would have been a time where that would have gone on, especially in the American Midwest, where people were pretty hostile to the draft.
Yeah, there was a lot of race riots at that time too, not just in the Midwest, but in New York, there was quite a few that I've studied where they just burned down whole black neighborhoods for no fucking reason. It's so incredibly stupid, and labor socialists at the time, they were fundamentally unable to see the commonality of interest in freeing the enslaved or black proletariat, as Du Bois refers it, and the struggle of labor in the North. You had people like Orestes Bronson, who's basically the archetype for this, tremendous labor radical, but he felt that the cause of the wage slave was more important than the cause of the chattel slave. That the wage slave had basically the same enslavement conditions as the chattel slave, but it was worse because of the fact that they were formally free, or free in terms of appearance and not in substance, which there's some truth to the analysis of wage slavery, but he's completely dropping the ball when he thinks that you have to, free the wage slave before you can free the chattel slave. It's really the other way around. But yeah, good point. Anyone else? Any other lingering comments from Dan's interview?
I think what Yemen is doing right now is just been so inspiring. To see them have to face what they faced in the 2010s, the absolute destruction that country faced, and look at the resistance they've put up. And of course you see very much the same reaction. Oh, the Houthis are just like Hamas. They're just like ISIS. They're just like Al Qaeda. As soon as the West hears an Arabic sounding name,
Yeah,
that's in power, that's resisting, they're the same as these different terrorist organizations that we've actually supported. But I think their actions are, I don't like calling it good news, but it's been the best news to read as of late regarding this issue.
And also, they're using brilliant tactics because they don't have a lot of money, and they really are just causing such a huge impact in this. It's brilliant.
and it's a people that was up until not long ago facing genocidal violence against them themselves. So it's very in some ways similar story to the Palestinian plight. The level of humanity that they show in the face of such tremendous oppression and violence is just outstanding. Any other questions, comments? Julie, I saw on the
Julie,
chat.
a question.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I have a real redneck question because it's gonna be Christmas. I'm gonna see my family, and I want to be able to answer this question for my family. Um, do the Palestinian people not have guns?
That's a great question, actually. We were just talking about this, Danny, Noah, and Eddie earlier today. And by the way, questions like this are perfect. Noah's planning on doing his show Real Talk in the form of call-ins. So these sorts of questions specifically concerned with how do we talk to our friends, families, neighbors, coworkers are perfect. The weaponry uh, that the Palestinians have is not the most advanced. Some of them do have guns um, that have came in through Egypt. There's a fly, but it's nowhere near comparison to what the Israelis have. It's really like archetypical of a David and Goliath situation, and a lot of the more advanced weaponry that they're capable of using are like made from makeshift uh, materials that they make themselves. So to some extent, they kind of do have guns, but nowhere near anything that would make the battle symmetrical.
I just feel like these instances where they talk about, I saw, for example, I saw on the news something about these Israeli military showed up in Ramallah and like kicked in people's doors and then like pulled them out their houses in the middle of the night. And I'm like, you would not want to try that in Youngstown for the same reason you wouldn't want to try that in Chicago or Detroit, because everybody has a gun and they're going to shoot back, especially in a situation like that. And I just don't hear that happening. So I'm like, did they pass a law to like take all the guns away from the Palestinians or something?
No, not necessarily. Well, Israel has been known to uh, attempt to disarm the Palestinians as much as possible, just so as a general part of their um, fight against the Palestinian struggle. But the Israelis are armed to the teeth. There's settlers walking around with weapons that are advanced, and uh, so that's part of why they're able to do that, specifically in the West Bank. It's just completely outmatched in terms of weaponry, and they're allowed to by the state. There's no repercussion for going in and taking someone's home with a weapon that people in the house cannot defend themselves from.
And also Dan had mentioned it, to get the PLO out of Lebanon, they killed tens of thousands of people. Like, it wasn't just a couple hundred, tens of thousands of people were killed via outright massacre with bullets, or the bombing campaigns. Like, if you look at footage of the bombing campaigns in Lebanon, they look very much like the bombing runs that have been done in Gaza lately. So if you think if Israel was willing to just essentially destroy as much of another country as they could, certainly they would take measures to make sure that their own people, well, not their own people, people within their immediate proximity couldn't resist. That's also why the human shield case is another example of accusation being projection. All of those kibbutzes, those separate the West Bank and Gaza. So if the resistance fighters wanted to reconnect the two, they would have to go through every kibbutz along the way, which they will end up doing at some point. So, but
That's
again,
pure projection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've seen clips of it that confirm it. We've covered some of them on stream, but I haven't seen one clip that can verify Hamas using Palestinians as human shields, but there's more than a few of Israelis using Palestinian prisoners as human shields and then killing them. Which is just, I mean, the stories come out, and regardless of how much knowledge you have of how horrendous Israel is, sometimes you ask, like, how can this be real?
Yeah.
How can you bulldoze, um, like how? How does a human being get to the point where even if they're getting that order from their higher ups, uh, they'll still do that? Like it's a sort of mentality that I can't even think about putting myself in those shoes. Um, it's so unhuman, and that's part of like what's central to this colonial violence, that in perpetuating it, they dehumanize themselves through the process of like this active dehumanization of the Palestinians. They dehumanize themselves.
Yeah.
How can you? Where's the humanity of the Israelis when 97% of the population supports what their government does? Some of them uh, agreeing that they're using enough violence, some of them saying that they need to use more violence. Actually, I think it's 98%, 98.2%, because only 1.8% thinks that the government is using too much violence against the Palestinians. So how do you get to that level of brainwashing that um, that people see this and think it's okay, or develop uh, chats on Telegram, so that all of the images that we see and have our stomachs turned by, and have our eyes watered by, and have our hearts broken by, they celebrate. So in many ways, like, and this might seem paradoxical, but the Palestinian struggle in its victory is the only force that can genuinely free these so-called Israelis from the active dehumanization that they have done to themselves through the process of colonizing the Palestinians. But let me see. Any Any questions or comments? I'm gonna hit up Eddie, see if he wants to hop on. I think he just got home from practice, by the way.
You use that term dehumanization, and that just triggered some memory for me of my father, who is a Vietnam veteran, and he talked about that many times about how the act of war, it made him feel like he was no longer part of the human race. Um, to the point where, like many other veterans of his era, he did not think that he ever could return to the United States because he thought he had so thoroughly, through war, removed himself from civil society. And it's like the Israeli security state and military, like they are like prison guards at like Shawshank. I mean, they are really just through their own violence that they're inflicting on other people, turning themselves into psychopaths.
Yeah, and it dehumanizes them, the oppressors. And, yeah, as much as they, view others as less than human, the impact is also on them, and they become dehumanized, and it's very hard to recover from that.
And I mean, I'm someone that's very much rooted in the traditions at the foundation of philosophy. I see the Marxist project almost like a culmination of the Socratic project, the Socratic project at a higher level, at a level where there's been a whole lot of historical sublations mediating it. But there's something that we get from the Socratic tradition that's directly a response to the sophists, which is that um, you have this question brought up, like, is being good something we do for its own sake or something we do to avoid punishment? And the sophists, which are in many ways philosophically rooted in many of the similar assumptions as postmodernists and a lot of the new fake left, um, the sophists answer that, well, the only reason why we act in ways that are considered socially good is because we are afraid of punishment. If we can remove punishment um, from the horizon, people would act in all sorts of ways. In the Republic, you have the story of the Ring of Gyges, and there's different stories that are examples that are brought up in this process. But the Socratic response is that in the process of me doing something unjust to someone else, I might hurt them physically. I might even traumatize them, but I'm destroying my soul. I'm destroying my humanity. I'm destroying what makes me uniquely human, what makes me a person. And I know this term soul is one that we might shiver as Marxists. I don't think we should. There's a materialist understanding of soul as what we are as human individuals. That's tarnished. How do you sleep at night when you do these actions to a fellow human being? Um, and that's a real crisis, and it's been taken up in the history of philosophy in many different ways. Um, Hegel, who is in many ways tremendously Eurocentric, the section on the phenomenology of spirit of the Lord and bondsman dialectic, that struggle for recognition that the Lord is unable to obtain because you cannot get recognition from a slave, someone who you have reduced to being ontologically inferior than yourself. But that dialectic was based on his following of the Haitian Revolution. And that's something that's not usually mentioned, but it takes different forms. And Fanon will go on and expand on that section of the Lord and Bondsman dialectic and provide an interesting analysis from the side of colonized peoples. But it's an old dictum. We usually attribute the following saying to Marx, Engels, or Lenin. We recently had, I think, Engels' birthday, and one of the main quotes that I saw people sharing around was, "A people that oppresses another cannot themselves be free." That's not from Marx, it's not from Engels, it's not from Lenin. It's from Dioniso Yupanqui. He's a Peruvian lawyer who uttered those words in 1814 at the Cadiz courts as a argument against colonialism. Like, you can't be free as long as you colonize me. And I think we're seeing this in a very heightened and evident form that's being unfolded against the people of Gaza and the West Bank.
And also, Carlos, you mentioned how do people sleep at night, and I think they actually don't in many cases. You know, many cases people who commit these kinds of atrocities, they suffer from PTSD,
Yeah.
and they literally cannot sleep at night because of what they've done.
Which is also a tragedy, because
Yeah.
in the case of the U.S., I mean, how many of our brothers and sisters enroll
Yes.
just to have the basic things that a regular rational society would give to people, but that you have to bet your life, throw yourself into war, come back with, wounds in the soul, wounds in your body, dismembered, sometimes in a casket, in order for what? To get healthcare, guaranteed a stable job where you can sustain a family, get an education. So many of our friends in the Midwest, that was the case. They get recruited out of high school. They're told you're going to be able to pay for college. They come from poor communities, usually Black and brown communities, and they tell them you're not going to get sent out. And then, a really good friend of mine, Richard, third year in, junior year, about to finish his undergraduate studies, gets sent to fucking Qatar. And that was the whole lot of them. Most of our wrestler friends, specifically, I got to meet through Eddie organizing them with the Bernie campaign. That was the reality of most of them. It's tremendously tragic. So, and when you have that sort of situation, that means that there's not like any real skin in the game for these soldiers. These soldiers are not fooled by patriotism as they might have been some decades ago by this, Parenti super patriotism. They know very much, a lot of them, what they're fighting for. They know that they're not representing their actual interest or the interests of their communities. And if they don't know yet, they will know at some point, as a lot of their colleagues end up coming to these moments of enlightenment. So it's a very scary situation for the ruling class when its armed bodies of men have the fertile conditions to flip on the ruling class that they're supposed to defend. Emily, I saw you unmute yourself. Do you have a comment or question?
Oh, whoops. No, that was an accident, sorry. But I did leave a comment that I thought connected with what you were talking about with the soul.
Maybe what it needs to be. Yes, good. Right. Yeah, it's I mean, one of the central ways that Marxism even comes to be is through the question of how it is that there's a crisis rooted at the human level in the human beings that the system produces. That's what the question of alienation is. Alienation is nothing but a disconnection. And if you look at the etymology of crisis, from crises means things that are supposed to be together being severed apart. And capitalism produces these sorts of situations where we sever ourselves from our own humanity through the activities that we're forced to participate in. And it takes various forms. But that humanistic ethos is something central to Marxism, and we can't let it fall by the wayside in order to emphasize the more scientific parts of the analysis. They both have to come together and compose the whole of what the Marxist worldview brings to the table that other worldviews don't. But yeah, any questions or comments? Any apologies again for not being Danny. I'm trying to keep the topics as focused on Palestine as I can. Julie, go ahead. Did you have a question or comment?
I have something, Carlos.
Oh.
I just wanted to say that I really developed and evolved as a person and as a socialist, just listening to Midwestern Marx. So you say you're not Danny, but you're amazing. You're incredible.
Thank you. It's great to hear, and we learn a lot
Yeah.
from the folks that also, in our view at least, make up the institute. The institute is not just us; it's all of us. Because at the end of the day, what we want to build is a project that changes the hearts and minds of people, and that hopefully at some point can become that material force that we need to break through this wretched order that we're thrown into and are forced to live under. Hopefully not for long. But
Yeah. And thank you for that.
I think just to say something, because Danny had asked me a while back to see if I wanted to do a class, and um, if I would have done one of the themes that I think I would have emphasized is the question of ideology, um, and how evident it is the forms of false consciousness that we're seeing coming out from the imperialist Zionist media. Um, the concept of false consciousness is rooted in Marxism, but it has its certain forms of precursors. You can even, I guess, trace it back to Plato's allegory of the cave, and then Burke, and then you have the French encyclopedists. You have Hegel, Feuerbach, who also uh, travels in many of the same um, forms of conceptualizations and critiques that get picked up by the Marxist critique of ideology. But one of the things that's central is that this understanding that the way that things are, the current social order, requires an understanding of itself that is inverted. When it reflects its material reality in the realm of ideas, that reflection is basically a refraction. It doesn't actually reflect, it refracts, and it inverts the way that things are. It turns the world on its head. It gives us, at the level of idea, a topsy-turvy worldview. And I think that when we look at the Israeli or the Zionist media, which would include the American media as well, it becomes extremely evident how it is that this functions. And Sam mentioned it earlier, the projections of human shields, human this, the stories of Hamas raping women, which are just baseless. There's no evidence for them. They're rooted in clear Zionist propagandists who, at the same time as they use these narratives that are baseless to attack the Palestinians, leading rabbis, extremist fundamentalist rabbis that hold important positions in the ideological apparatuses of the Zionist state have written justifications for the rape of women in the case of enemies and for the killing of babies. And they root it and embellish it in this theological veneer of the Torah. So that's literally putting reality on its head. And just like this example, there's a plethora of them where the world is literally inversed in the Zionist understanding of it. And I think what we're seeing, thanks to, in part, social media, but also thanks to the fact that we don't have the material incentive to look away because our lives are shit as well, unlike they were in the, I don't know, 60s, 70s. The golden age of American capitalism, where we had a largely white, but some form of a middle class, people that had stability. We've been reproletarianized, and so we don't have the material incentives to live away. When our lives are shit, and our government is sending tens, or in the case of Ukraine, hundreds of billions of dollars to fund Nazis and now a genocide of an indigenous people, it makes looking away harder. So we're scrolling through our phones, we're seeing all of this, and what we're noticing is that we look at the media and we look at the reality that's literal fucking evidence in front of us, 24/7, just keeps pouring in. And what do people come to realize? They might not have it in the Marxist jargon, but they realize that reality is being inverted in the Zionist propaganda. And as I always mention, like if we treat like a certain fabric, like if this isn't the best fabric, and I'm not gonna try it. There's some fabric that is very stable, and you won't be able to rip it apart until you create a small slit. And once you create a small slit, you're able to rip it apart like nothing. There's a few fabrics that function like that. Ideology is something similar. Once people break through in one area, it's extremely easy to have them rip the whole thing apart. And if they see the intensity with which the ideological apparatuses of their states propel this inversion of reality, it's going to be easier than ever before for them to see that at play in general all across society. And what that creates is a crisis of legitimacy, a crisis of authority, a crisis of consent. People
Don't
end up
you
not. Yeah, go ahead, Jude.
don't you think that we are headed towards that in the United States of America?
I think in some areas we're already there. Um, in some areas we're definitely already there, and we're there. I think part of the problem is that the it's not a homogenous group that is there. It's taken very different forms. So like with the Trumpers and the MAGA base, it takes the form of questioning the deep state and questioning the establishment and Sorrow and this and that, and they have their own language or even like worldview through which they see through the crack. And then it takes a different form through like the progressives and the social democrats and uh, as Marxists, we assume that the form that it takes with us is a much more concrete, systematized, and comprehensive one. And the idea is like if we're able to get all of these groups of people that because of their material conditions and because of the general conditions of a decaying capitalist imperialism have come to question the existing order through various forms. If we're able to appeal to them from where they're at and give them this outlook that allows them to understand the world, make sense of it easier. Because if you're operating with a worldview of just like evil lizard people that are ruling the world, and someone explains to you how everything is happening and how it's rooted in political economy and in all these historical factors, you're going to prefer the explanation that actually explains, not the one that somewhere has to have this logical leap of there's a bad person and they're just doing bad things for the sake of doing bad things. You're going to prefer the explanation that actually explains, that has reasons, that has a logos behind it. We have to learn how to do that with each of these discontented parts of our society that are currently fragmented amongst each other because there's still some influence from the elite uh, pushing that fragmentation. Our job is to reduce that disunity that the elite produce and allow them to develop these more coherent ways of looking at things that align themselves, I think, with the socialist movement, which it's not very hard to do, folks. It is not very hard to do. When we know we're still working in the Midwest, and we have found that the biggest factor in being able to quote unquote radicalize someone and bringing someone over to the socialist cause, to the explicit class struggle or the class struggle for itself, is their class position, their economic condition. For us in Dubuque, Iowa, most of working people there were Trumpers. And I had came from Miami with an understanding of the Trumpers, just specifically the working class Trumpers, just the backwards, racist, misogynist, etc. That's the antinomy of the socialist worker or whatever. But we got there and we organized these people tremendously easy. And then the middle class liberals, the lawyers, professors, there was basically no organizing them. And that's not something we should generalize. We have an extremely diverse country. In other areas, it might be the opposite. You know, the petty bourgeois and bourgeois elements are more rooted in Trump, and then the proletarian elements are more rooted in a traditional liberal DNC perspective that is dissatisfied with that party, but is not willing to go to the Trump or Republican Party. So um, I do think that those breaks in consent and popular consent are already occurring. If you look at the youth, if you're the ruling class, you have to be shitting your pants right now. You have to, the vast
They
majority of
are.
youth,
They're building
yeah,
underground bunkers.
they absolutely are. And that's reflected in the censorship campaigns and well, basically everything in all of their actions. Their youth, which is the future of the country, the vast majority of them, every time they're polled, they do not see capitalism as a favorable system. And yes, we can argue that the idea of socialism that they have is very much tinted and mediated by the Bernie Sanders Scandinavian model, whatever, but that is an unprecedented development in US history. Um, so it's I say this a lot and I mean it. And you know, sometimes old heads look at me say it and they're like, yeah, yeah, we said that in our day too. But um, I genuinely think that we are in those periods of time, specifically in our country, but also at the level of the whole world, where we're approaching those weeks where decades happen, as Lenin was fond of saying. And the question is like, what force is going to organize those spontaneous uprisings? Are we going to let them be diffused into just let's vote for Democrats? Are we going to let the right organize them? Or are we going to get our shit together, put petty disagreements, parity fetish politics aside, focus on what's important, focus on the principal contradiction at hand, and unite in order to unite our class and have transformative politics that actually changes things and that doesn't just change one imperialist, fascistic face for another one at the level of the presidency. And that's always been like the goal of our project. We've refined our ideas throughout the years as we've learned and studied and talked with people and learned from the audience. But it's always been very much rooted in a non-sectarian approach to things and in the need to put petty differences aside and focus on what's principal, what's primary. I think that's the only way we're going to do it. I mean, look at the Cuban Revolution. Look how broad the Cuban Revolution went in terms of the coalitions that they built. They had like everything from later on, because the Communist Party didn't support it, but later on they had anything from the Communist Party, like anarchist groups, the Popular Socialist Party, and to Orthodox nationalist parties, which is nationalist in the colonized sense, not in the Hitler sense, of course. But those Orthodox nationalists were like liberals, mainstream liberals that just wanted Cuban capitalists to exploit Cuban workers and not American ones. But the coalition was quite broad. It was a unified movement, and every single successful revolutionary struggle is about realizing who the friends of the people are, who are the people that we ought to be uniting with, and who objectively stands on the side of the class that we're trying to overcome, to take power from. And I mean, even just working through it at a theoretical level, if dividing the people is so essential for the ruling class, and they say this explicitly, Federalist 10, uniting the people has to be essential for the forces fighting against that ruling class. So those are, what we have to do. We need organization, though, and there's organizations out there, some of them doing good work, but I don't see anyone with, I don't see any of them with this sort of mindset. So it's a crisis of organization, and within those organizations, of course, you have a crisis of ideology. a theoretical crisis, and not just within those organizations, but in the left in general, I think. So but with what we have at the Institute, we can help with the ideological crisis, but we're not a party. We don't have a organization on the ground, so we can't really with that other part, at least not yet, or not now. Um, but yeah, maybe I'm totally wrong. I hope I'm wrong, and some of the existing parties lead a revolution next year or something. That would be fantastic. Um, we would love to be wrong in the areas where our analysis is a bit more critical or pessimistic. We're more tied to advancing the class struggle than to ensuring that history proves us right. We prefer to make things better, not just to be right in our analysis.
I like what you said about focusing on the principal contradiction, because I've seen people on Twitter say things like, well, Hamas are nationalists and, we can't get on board with that, or something to that effect. It might be, oh, they're Muslim extremists. It could be this, that, or the other. And it just shows how not knowing about other revolutionary experiences can make you sound quite foolish, because the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists fought fiercely for years and years and years, and then donned each other's uniforms to fight Japanese imperialists. Once the Japanese imperialists were out, they went right back to fighting to finish that principal contradiction, because the principal contradiction became Japanese imperialism. Once Japanese imperialism was, successfully destroyed, the principal contradiction became the communists versus the nationalists again. And so these people can't realize that the principal contradiction right now is not the Popular Front fighting for a singular, secular, socialist Palestinian state versus Hamas trying to establish a singular, religious Palestinian state. We're not even at that point yet. And it's interesting that you mentioned who are our real enemies, who are our real friends. That's how the front opens up their strategy, quoting Mao. So good stuff all around.
Yeah, who the friends of the people are. That goes back to Lenin in the 90s. It's an important text by the same name. Who the friends of the people are, and then Mao, as he did quite often, systematizes and refines that analysis in his work on contradictions amongst people. I think that's what we deal with most of the time when we're online, unless we're like talking to the Fed bots that are just there to cause havoc. But when we're talking to real people and we have disagreements, I think most of the time we're just dealing with contradictions amongst the people. And we have to be able to navigate in our assessment which contradictions are antagonistic, which ones aren't. This is why Mao's incredible. The theoretical developments he makes in the form of elaborating the particularity of contradictions we already had before that, the universality of contradictions, but the particularity in the form of the categories of principal and non-principal contradiction, and antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradiction, and principal aspect and secondary aspect of it. Those are all fundamental, and we can't just leave it at oh, I read it, now I know the concept, that's it. No, we have to apply it. And not apply it dogmatically. Don't just copy and paste it, but like from an assessment, a concrete assessment of your reality, see what's principle. And I think that most people are coming to see that in the US, the most principal thing is fighting the establishment right now. In that fight against the establishment, so many other problems are solved. The problem of our government's role in perpetuating the imperialist system, the problem of the conditions of the people, all these other the problems of the sort of rigidity of politics, where it's dominated by this duopoly that's really just one party with two sides of it. So I think that's the focus, and you can't say if this is the principal contradiction at hand, then what we ought to do in our political practice is make a united front against Trump that implies voting and canvassing and organizing for the Democrats. I don't think those two things work or come together. Like, if the principal thing is fighting against the elite that's destroying the world and our lives, picking one side of it in this conjuncture over and against the other side is not the right way forward. And it hasn't been for the last 50 years that we've been pursuing that policy as various organizations on the communist left. I mean, fucking take this issue of the genocide of the Palestinians. Look at what Reagan, of all people, the amount of pressure Reagan would put on Israel when the massacres of the Palestinians got to a level that's a fraction of what it is now. Look at Carter. Look at even Bush Jr., George W. Bush. You know, even he was putting a hell of a lot more pressure than what we're seeing from the most pro-union president in history, who we must vote for in order to prevent the takeover of our democracy. Democracy, I don't know, I haven't interacted with it in the 20-some years I've been in this country. So, but anyways, we're nearing the 9 o'clock Central, 10 o'clock time, which means that we could be wrapping up in around 10 minutes or so, and then I'll toss the host ship to whoever wants to stay on and converse. Actually, I hit the gym late, so I have to go to the gym as soon as I head out. So as soon as we finish, I mean. So, but any questions or comments?
What are some of the plans for the Institute regarding Palestine in particular? I know we've talked about, like Danny's talked about, revolutionary writing class, the second part of Reform or Revo, but with Palestine in particular, what's the Institute thinking about?
Well, we want to publish a book of poems from Danny. Danny's actually I didn't know this until this week, but he's won awards for his poetry in Venezuela. He's actually a great poet. I was reading some of his stuff yesterday for this upcoming book, and it's the sort of thing you read it out loud and you get chills through your body. Like it's really good. So we want to put that out as soon as possible because it's 48 poems on this ongoing genocide. Half of them in English, half in Spanish. So we're planning on doing something pretty cool where we have on one side the English and it'll have the front flap. And then instead of having a back flap, the back flap would be the front flap for the Spanish book. And that way we can reach as many people as possible. So it's 24 poems in each language and 17 questions in each language for Israel. And it's extremely important. And hopefully with that, we would like to convene a panel of artists who have been active in the struggle of the Palestinian people and discuss what's the ongoing genocide, the ongoing plight of the Palestinians, because this discussion cannot only be surrounded by genocide when our brothers and sisters are actually winning the combat, and when at the global level, the Palestinian side is winning the information war. But it scares Israel so much that they have to fake capturing Hamas fighters. But it'd be interesting to get a good group of artists who have been active promoting the Palestinian cause together to discuss the role of art in struggles such as the ones that we're facing, both at the immediate level and at the longer level of the struggle for socialism. I haven't discussed yet with Danny whether he plans on continuing a class like this. I know in the past he's told me that as long as this genocide continues, the necessity for a class like this continues. And I agree with that. wholeheartedly. But he is heading after the holidays to Haiti. He's been doing activist work, revolutionary work in Haiti since the mid-90s, and he goes every year a few times and stays there for a while. So I'm not sure how long he'll be there, but he'll be there from around January 6th or so. And it's a tremendously difficult situation. And it's hard because he's got so many contacts there that are telling him how ridiculous the situation is, specifically in Port-au-Prince, but um, everything, regardless of how bad it is, it's hard to not have it be kind of overshadowed by a literal fucking genocide that we're seeing live through our screens. So um, he's going to be in Haiti. I don't know for how long, but um, if on hopefully there's a permanent ceasefire. But if there isn't, I could see him maybe bringing keeping this class going after that next year. Um, yeah, as far as the work that we're doing for Palestine, that's and then we're always doing broadcasts on it and publishing articles. So um, that's about as much as we can do. I wish we could have like a Lincoln Brigade sorts and up to go.
I
We
was
think it's pretty quick.
I was on a phone call late with Danny. I don't understand. Like, I'm on West Coast time, and he'll call me, and it's like 1 a.m, and I'm like, dude, it's like dawn where you're at.
He's
What is it?
Yeah, he doesn't
He's
sleep.
a workhorse. But
Yeah.
this was a poem that he was just kind of running through with me. I couldn't offer any edits because it's just amazing. But it goes: the Holocaust will not be televised. The CNN of the bombed and napalmed. The voice of the white phosphorized, the napalmed and chemical weaponized, the misunderstood, humiliated, and defiled, the voiceless, mangled, and genocided, the MSNBC of the nameless and anonymous, spiritually connected to the chastised, bastardized, and colonized. We are all Palestine.
That was amazing. Yeah. Yeah, I read one yesterday that was incredible. And he has one on racial Maddow as well. That's uh, it's funny and concise and poignant.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
calls her a colonial feminist. It's pretty
which is true.
Wasser.
Um,
Yeah.
less and less people are falling for the woke washing of the elite. Um, especially with this ongoing genocide. One of the major appeals to the progressives in the US has been the issue of LGBTQ rights and women's rights, and the pitching of Israel as this beacon, enlightened beacon um, of these marginalized and oppressed groups. But one, it's not true. But two, people haven't fell for it. People haven't fell for it. So that's an interesting um, development. Hopefully, it's consistent. I think that I say this often, but part of what marks the difference um, between the Marxist analysis and other people who just end up being correct every once in a while with certain events is that um, the Marxist worldview gives you the outlook to ensure that when you get something right, it's not just right opinion. It didn't just happen that you stumbled across the right view in this specific event. It gives you the ability to make that consistent and to connect the series of events because a lot of the Trumpers were right to some extent with the question of Ukraine, and then a lot of them turn around and support Zionism because Trump does. So, um, how do they get both right, but not only get both right, connect them to the imperialist system and how these events are reflections of the needs of imperialism? Oh my God, Ukrainian and Palestinian flags, that would make me barf. I haven't seen any, but thankfully, I haven't seen any. But um, yes, Emily. Emily also had a question there before Sam asked.
Oh, I didn't have a question, but I will say the Ukraine flags at the Palestine protest. I don't know. There's something about that. How come people aren't making the connection? It's almost like, I don't want to say, but it almost seems like amongst the youth, there's more social acceptability for Palestine and not the Ukraine question. And I wonder if maybe that's why they're picking up on it and not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's strange. If I had to guess what the reaction would have been on the Palestinian question, I would have thought that it would have been a whole lot more like the, the proxy war against Russia, where just the Ukrainian flag became like the thing that you just post everywhere. But it hasn't been the case, and I guess it's good in that sense, but it's also we have to be cautious because that means that there's a whole lot of people that are on our side on this issue that will turn around and not be on our side on other issues. Um, and that means we can work with them on this issue, but always be very clear about some of the other issues at hand. Yes. So as far as I want to give a couple updates for the Institute. We've been a bit backlogged with the publishing press. I think the last book we published was 6 months ago. That is wholly my fault. That I'm the person that leads that part of the project, and I have like 10 different manuscripts from various authors that we've been editing and preparing. But we have a very important and theoretically rich, quite advanced book from Yanis Iqbal on education in the age of neoliberalism coming out early next year. That one's fully ready to go. We have the commentary on proletarian revolution and the renegade Kautsky coming out hopefully towards the end of this week, if not early next week, from Professor Thomas Riggins. We have Danny Shaw's poems, a couple more books from Tom, uh, two books from Alan and Radhika, the Tsai, one book that's a collection of various critics of Western Marxism and academic super-radicalisms that's hopefully going to be out sometime in the middle of next year. That includes people like John Bellamy Foster, Gabriel Rockhill, Radhika and Allen, Vivek Shibber, and a few other folks who do great work criticizing various trends that are hip in the academy and that try to pass themselves off as radical. And we have a lot more classes coming up. I hope to teach early next year a class on Marxist philosophy. So for those that took my class on Marxism and the history of Western philosophy, you might be interested in this other one where I'm going to be focusing just on Marxist philosophy. And I'm sure I'm missing something. Oh, Noah's teaching his Basics of Marxism class again. And one of the more prominent parties in the US is going to be sending one of its chapters is going to be sending its people, students as well. So that'll be interesting and good, I think, hopefully influential in that party. But yeah, that's those are the major updates from what the Institute is doing. And yeah, if there's no other questions or comments, I can stop the recording and give hostship to whoever would like it to keep it going. If that's something you would like to do today, but let me stop the recording.